a whirlwind in the past few weeks at Flume, and the support we've had is unprecedented for the initiative we've put into place. And I massively thank all of you guys and girls as sales leaders and potentially sales people who are here as well, seeing what they should expect from their sales leaders for supporting this, but also the 1,700 people that we had last time. We've got over 420 people who are predominantly going to be sales leaders who are here today. So it's an amazing support, and also from our partners at the AEO, Mash Media and PPA, who have got so behind what we're doing and supporting this in such an incredible way. And we've all got the same cause, I think, which is to try and come through this in as positive place as we can and to work together to do that. So I really want to put that out there because it's making all of this happen, and I genuinely think it's making a big difference to what teams can do and what you guys can do. And we're here to share everything we possibly can at Flume to help you and your teams navigate these really tough times. In terms of today, we're looking specifically at leading remote sales teams, which is obviously a huge challenge and a big shift for a lot of people, not least the people on those teams who are now working from home. But just so you know, at the end of the session today, there will be time for questions. So we'll have about probably half an hour. So at the bottom, I think someone's already put one in there. You can write in your questions that you really want to be answered by the end. So at the end, I will try my best to give you my views, our views at Flume on what you want to ask. So please feed into those as we go through. I won't answer them till the end, but I will try and cover all of the ones that you want covered. As I said before, vote up any questions you think particularly pertinent that you want answered. My recommendation when you listen to this is to be selfish. And what I mean by that is just think about you and think about your teams and use it as an opportunity for real self-reflection and think about what can you put into place here to come out of this in the best position possible, because it's an exceptionally tough time for everyone. And as I go through today, I want to acknowledge that it is a very sensitive time for everyone, and we've all got stuff going on outside of work as well. I have, you guys have, and more than ever, work and home and personal life is kind of merging. And if I use any insensitive words today, like revenues or opportunities, I'm not meaning to offend in any way. I'm trying to do the right thing. So hopefully it'll be useful for you guys. And hopefully you can take some of this away and put it into practice immediately after this, and hopefully share it with some of your teams and colleagues and peers as well. So let's look at what we're going to go through today. Actually, just before I do that, it's probably worth just talking about this. So just so you're aware, because some of you will have seen this a lot, been quite present on social media channels, maybe too present in some cases, but we've created a lot of free sources of information. So we've, on our website, actually created a COVID response page, and it's got all of our free information on there. So that includes blogs, as you can see here. We've got a LinkedIn page. We've got LinkedIn groups, and also we've created YouTube channels. Yesterday, we created something called Flume Chat, which is interviews with the thought leaders, I suppose, in the industry. So if you do have people you think you want to nominate who you think can really add to the what's working and what's the best way forward right now, then please let us know and feed in some names as well. That'd be really useful. I'll remind you about that at the end, but it's worth saying. At the end of this session as well, you'll also get a white paper if you get in contact with us, so we can feed that over to you, and that will summarize most of the stuff we've got here, but we'll give you real detail as to how to get that at the end. So let's dive into what we're going to cover. Three main areas, and they are all aimed to allow you guys to work out the best ways to work with your personal teams. We've got a range of different levels of people here, sales leader wise, and a range of size of teams, as we can see by the polls that we've done here. So I'm going to try and give you kind of a catch-all where you can go through, look at stuff from your team's perspective. We talk about a lot, and I'll share this in a minute on the slide, but the biggest mistake sales leaders can make ever, but especially right now, is to look at everything from their own perspective and not their sales team. So we're going to shift you out of your head into the head of the sales teams and think, what are they going through? What's changed in terms of how they're motivated, how they're driven, and how they're feeling. That then allows us to have a look at the mistakes. So what's the worst that could happen for a salesperson working from home, potentially with their friends who they may or may not like in a flat in London, sitting on the edge of their bed in a completely different situation than they've ever been in before. So what doesn't work, and that allows us to sculpt some rules, some approaches that you guys can start using to help your sales teams perform in the best way possible. So 3 simple steps we'll go through. Throughout this, I'll throw in tons of tips and ideas as we go through it as well. So it's worth scribbling the stuff down if you think it's going to be useful. So just to remind you of something I mentioned just then, at Flume, we've got a very, very strong principle, which is the best way to work out how to do something with someone else is to get into the other person's shoes and think about it from their perspective. That, from a sales perspective, we talked about this last Wednesday, gives salespeople a way of doing things, which is that they should look at everything from the client's perspective to work out the best approaches for them on a sales approach. But the same works for sales leaders. And we suggest that the biggest mistake sales leaders tend to make is to look at everything from their own perspective and not their sales teams. So if we can get into the sales team's perspective and think what's going to work, what's not going to work for them, what they're going through, it allows us to adapt and create mechanisms that are going to help them work how you need them to be working. So we're going to move into looking at things from your team's shoes or your team's perspective. I'll take you through these bit by bit. The interesting thing about this, when I was putting this presentation together, because obviously we've specifically designed this for you guys, is there's a lot of overlap with what your clients are going through, but there's some anomalies as well in some different parts. So let me take you through and have a think about those team members you've got, whether it's 10 people, 5 people, or 2 people, or 1 person, or maybe it's just yourself. But have a think about how true these are of them and what they're going through. Because the more we can empathize with them and understand them, the more we can respond and drive them. So the first thing is this idea of motivation has moved from ego to security. And we talked about this last week, but it's going to be so true right now of your teams. So depending on where they were 3 or 4 weeks ago before things started to really dramatically shift, their motivation levels have probably changed from ego or esteem, where they may have been before, where they're overperforming and they had those needs fulfilled. Whereas now there's a lot of risk involved. They're working from home. Maybe their event's been stopped. Maybe they don't know what they're selling. Maybe some people are stopping working in their teams. And for them, there's a big risk. There's a security piece. And very much the motivation for a lot of people would have been down to protecting themselves. Now, the other side of this is they're probably going to be bringing a lot of their outside life into work, not least because their home now is their office. A lot of these people, I alluded to it before, might be working in London or working in the city or wherever, but actually their home is where they're working, and they might be living with, depending on if they're millennial or not, or their setup. They might not have the family there. They might be on their own, but they might be in a room with 4 other people in that house and they're having to work off their bed. Their scenario has completely and utterly changed, and they're thinking about themselves more than ever before because there's so much happening outside of work, and often that's being brought into work as well. And just like your clients, they're going to be responding differently emotionally. It's unstable, it's uncertain, and different people, when stress levers come in, react in different ways. Different personalities, when they get overstretched, go to different places. So you might be seeing some different behavior from some of these teams. Some of them might have really stepped up, some of them might have really shied away, but different people are going to be responding differently because of the circumstances. And they're distracted. They've got PlayStation, they've got Xbox One, they've got Netflix, they've got their friends, they've got their kids, they've got a family, they've got everything. And some people are brilliant at coping with that, other people aren't. And being in a completely different focused environment or unfocused environment for some people, again, a lot depending on the personality type, is a tough situation for them. And this is a big one, and we'll talk about this quite a lot today. And when we get to the rules, there'll be a big piece around this, is that there's been a big shift, not just in terms of what works for clients, as we talked last week, but also in terms of what and how they should be working. So one of the biggest issues they will have is they'll be thinking, I don't know what good looks like. I don't know what's expected of me. I don't know how I'm meant to be behaving. And so when a sales leader either congratulates or scolds, depending on their behavior, sometimes it can feel unfair or surprising because they don't know what good looks like. So a big bit we'll talk about today is defining new behaviors, setting a vision, and making sure that there's a charter for how you should be working with them, and also what good looks like for them, because without that, it's very difficult for them to have certainty. And the biggest question really they're going to be able to ask themselves, or will be asking themselves in this time, is what the hell am I supposed to do? What is going to get me through this? What do I have to do as a salesperson right now, which is going to mean in 6 months' time, I'm where I want to be, which is coming out of this in a strong position. And ultimately, as a sales leader, it's probably one of the most important things we should be thinking about trying to answer for them on a regular basis. So that kind of gives us a way of thinking about what we need to do with our sales teams, because ultimately we want to answer, well, this is what you're supposed to do. This is how you need to do it. And well done for doing that. But without setting that out before they ask that question, they're not going to be able to answer it. So this is an interesting bit, because leadership has always been massively important. I've got a slide here that says your leadership approach is more crucial than ever. And what we mean by that, if you go into the time before the crisis, if we can remember that, then actually the impact of leadership on the engagement of your sales teams was always huge. We just maybe never realized or acknowledged it. But if you look at this, in normal times, the sales leadership accounts for 70% in the variance of employee engagement. What that means is that you as a sales leader, knowing it or not, you have the ability to affect someone from being 30% engaged up to 100% engaged. Quite obviously, right now, engagement is the crucial word that we need to be aiming for and driving, because we need people to be as focused as possible to work in the best way for their teams and for them and for you. So engagement is huge. And because of the shift in how we're working with the teams, and it's all remote, and because of what they're going through, the impact of this variance and the engagement levels is going to be dramatically exaggerated, depending on what you do as a sales leader. And that can be positive or negative. And just like your clients will remember the sales experience and sales approach that we talked about last week, your teams will remember more than ever, how did their leader work in these tough times? Were they someone who helped them and drove them, or were they someone who held them back and scolded them? And I know that's a bit of a black and white view, but the point being that they're in emotional times and they will remember this stuff and remember what you do for them. And the impact you can have is bigger than it's ever been. So what we're going to do with that kind of lens of looking through things from your sales team's point of view, what we're going to look at now is we're going to have a think about the mistakes that, from a sales team's point of view, sitting at home, working, doing their best in most cases, what are the worst things that a sales leader could do for them? There's about 7 or 8 tips here, which they turn into tips once you go through the mistakes. So it could be worth scribbling some of these down if you think any of these are ones you can take on and put into your teams and ways of working. Some of these are obvious, some of them are less obvious, but I'm going to put it out there so we've all got a common language. So number one, and this I find fascinating, is using the same if-then incentives. So for some of you, you would have read a book called Drive by Dan Pink. If you haven't and you want to shortcut the whole book, then go to Google and type in Dan Pink and type in purpose, autonomy and mastery, and you'll see a brilliant video about it. Don't do it yet because you can do that after this, but worth looking at. I want to explain what he talks about and what that means right now for you and your team. So if then incentives, pretty obviously a carrot and stick. If you do this, you get that. If you hit your target, you get that. The problem with if then incentives right now is that the way that your clients need the salespeople to operate with them is very different. It's all turned on its head. And what the salesperson needs to do is, in some cases, new and different. And there's this piece around being empathetic and being purposeful that we talked about last time, and also being valuable. And just by saying to a salesperson, if you, this is a very crude example, hit that target, hit that amount of calls or whatever it might be, you'll get this money, then for them, it makes them think, okay, I've got to do that, but it stops them thinking about how to do that. And the problem right now is how to operate with your clients, and why would a client pick up the phone or want to interact with us in any way? It is so different, and it's such an important question. Just saying, if you do this, you'll get that, doesn't help the sales team. And at the moment, more than ever, they need help working out how to behave with clients. So if then incentives, I'm not saying not to incentivize people with them, but only focusing on that could be a big no-no, because it can actually paralyze your team in terms of how they should be behaving with their clients. We'll look at that more later when we come to the rules. The next one is micromanagement. And depending on your personality and also very much your trust levels, because it's a huge part of this remote sales leadership is trust levels. Some people will naturally move into a micromanagement bit. And interestingly, on the polls that you guys filled in before here, a big part of what you're doing is communicating with your team and kind of spending a lot of time communicating with your team. And I don't know what that communication is yet because we haven't kind of got that out of the polls and the research, but sometimes that can be through over management, micromanagement, and continuously checking your team are doing what they need to do. And the interesting thing with that is if you put yourself in a team's perspective, that can cause, depending on who they are, big resentment, pushback, and thinking, you don't trust me, just leave me to it. Now, there's obviously a balance with that. And we don't want to just not micromanage and never be in touch. But it kind of links into this next one, which is not considering situational leadership. So I'm sure a lot of you will know about situational leadership, but just for anyone who isn't aware, situational leadership is the idea that with a salesperson or any person who has an ability at a task, so it might be their ability to adapt to today's buyer in the crisis. Most people are going to be pretty novice at that because it's brand new. So based on someone who's new at a task, situational leadership suggests that you should be directing them. Then someone who's a bit more experienced, you should be coaching them. Even more experienced, supporting them with their ideas. And even more experienced, you should be delegating roles and work to them. So the idea here is just not always assuming that everyone's in the same place. Some people are going to be far more able to work this stuff out themselves and work in a capacity with you where you can support them. Other people will need direction. So making sure you're tapping into how skilled they are at certain tasks and helping them in the way they need is really important. On top of that, assuming that the same things are important to them as before, this is back to that motivation bit we talked about before, and that now security for them in the motivation hierarchy of needs from Maslow is a big, big part. And just recognition around how well they're doing or celebrating that they've brought in the biggest deal. And I'm getting crude examples, but quite typical of a lot of sales team. They really appeal to the esteem bit at the top of that triangle. Whereas right now, different things are important to them. They want to know they're safe. They want to know they're okay. They want to know they've got a plan for the next few months. They want to know how to get where they need to get to and how to do what they need to do. So don't just assume everything that's important for them 3 months ago is important to them now, because things for them have changed. So the conversations you need to have has also changed. And using the same metrics is very much linked, but some of you might be lucky enough to have pivoted brilliantly to digital or created new product streams or whatever it might be, but actually their clients, in a lot of cases, salespeople's clients aren't going to be as likely to pick up the phone, pick up the email. They might not be able to make such quick decisions. They might take longer looking at proposals, whatever it might be. So using the same metrics as before can be a difficult thing for salespeople to accept because the way clients are responding has changed. So making sure you're adapting your measurements and metrics to what is working now and happening now in the industry is really important to make it fair and realistic, but stretched for your team. Assuming they'll all respond in the same ways. So this comes down to personality types amongst other things. So there's lots of different personality types. You've got very crudely the driven, you've got the thinker, you've got the creative, and you've got the empathetic collaborator. And depending on where you are on that, you'll manage and communicate in a certain way. But the point is that every single one of your teams is a mix of all of those, and they're all individual. So just communicating in one way with everyone, especially because everyone's thinking about themselves right now, is quite dangerous. We need to make sure we are empathizing with them and tapping into them as a person and acknowledging them and noticing their personality to get the most out of them and to make things make sense for them. And the next one is assuming that they know what to do. I'm just going to check the next one, so I'm making sure that, yeah. So this is, for me, probably one of the most important bits. And actually, before putting this presentation together, we nearly decided to put that as number one, but these aren't prioritized, so we mixed them up. But things have changed. We talked about it last week. What works for clients has changed. What salespeople need to be doing has changed. And how they need to be approaching clients has changed. What they need to be doing in terms of LinkedIn has changed. Like, so much has changed. And one of the biggest mistakes we see sales teams make is they've moved to remote and they try and keep doing things the same way, but they don't ever come up with a charter or a belief approach or a behavior agreement where people know what good looks like now. Because the simplest way of thinking about it is if your team and you have not co-created and agreed what good looks like in terms of behaviors, then it becomes very difficult for them to know what they should be doing. It also becomes very difficult for you guys to acknowledge and celebrate when they've done it well, but it also becomes very unfair and difficult for you to say when they've done it badly because there's been no agreement. So a massive takeaway here, and a lot of you I'm sure have done it, but is to create a charter with the team, a way of working, a way of communicating as well, but built around a vision and built around behaviors. And we'll talk about that a bit later, but it's one of the biggest things you can do to make sure your team are working in the right direction, in the right way, and that you can motivate them with the right approaches. And the last one here is something I see happening again and again and again. And it's a really, I think, typical thing when we get pressure from above. We get pressure from our CEO or our sales director, whoever it might be, whatever level you're at. And sometimes that comes down as pressure. And one of the biggest things you have the ability to do is to be a valve and to be someone who can just look at that pressure and pause and think, what's going to be useful for my teams? Because the natural thing is just to open a valve up and pass all of that pressure down. And that does nothing to help your teams in terms of motivation and getting them to think in the right way about working with their clients. So making sure you're filtering this stuff in the right way to make sure you're passing the messages down that your teams need is absolutely crucial. So a lot of mistakes there we can avoid. Have a think about if any of those are relevant to you or if anyone on your team has used that sort of stuff. And next time you fall into that trap or they do, use this as a way to just have a bit of an epiphany and think, oh, shouldn't be doing that. And we'll move on in a little while into how we should be working. So before we get to that bit, I want to just share with you something which I think is incredibly important. And I'll go back to one of my favorite ever books. It's probably up there somewhere, which is also a TED Talk. It's the fourth most downloaded TED Talk of all time by a chap called Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K. Most of you would have heard of him. He talked about the idea of a golden circle. He wrote a book called Start With Why. Download TED Talk, well worth watching, much better than what I'm about to say here in terms of these 3 minutes about it. But I'll try and summarize it, and then I'm going to bring it back into why it's so important right now for you. So what Simon Sinek talks about is people don't buy into what you do or what you say. People buy into why you do what you do. And that's why last week when we were in the sales crisis webinar, we talked about the idea of really harnessing your purpose. So realizing and getting together as a team and thinking, why do we need to exist right now for clients? Why do clients need us right now? And we talked about the idea that for most of you, it's probably going to be similar to what we've got at Flume, which is we know the only reason we can exist right now for clients is if we can help clients navigate this tough time. And ultimately, that's all your clients are going to care about as well. How do they get through this? But this also transposes this why, how, what piece that Simon Sinek talks about, also transposes over onto sales leadership. So if we look at a sales leader's why, there's a very simple one at the heart of everything. And I don't mean to condescend when I'm showing this, but it's worth having it in mind because it gives us an idea as to why the behaviors we're about to introduce are the right ones. So right now, I believe the only reason why you or any of your sales leaders should be existing, your purpose has to be to make it easy. Make it easy for your sales teams to overperform during the crisis. Make it easy for them to deliver the approach your clients need to get through this crisis. Everything you do has to be focused around that cause. And it's worth, for the record, being open with your teams about that. That is why you exist. And having a brainstorm, how can you help? How can we do that? By going into that brainstorm about how you can help, what you'll probably come up with is something similar to what I'm about to share. I'm going to take you through 3 core behaviors with a load of tips behind them to help you put this into place in your teams with your companies to help get them to the point where you, them, and the clients have navigated this in the best way possible. So as sales leaders, sales leader behaviors to help you and the team come through this in a strong way possible. I didn't need to repeat that. That's what I just said. So we're going to have a look at these. So number one is we're going to have a look at the idea of focus. These aren't chronological, but they kind of make sense in a prioritized order. So the first one around focus is back to that thing that I mentioned before, which is that people need to know what good looks like. They need to know where they're going. They need to know why they're doing what they're doing. They need to have agreed how they're going to be working, because without that side of things, they're so different from what they were in before in terms of position in their office, now on the edge of their bed or wherever they are, and they're on their own. They're with loads of people, and clients have changed, and what works in sales is different. Like, there's so much up in the air that to assume everything's the same and they're just going to get on with it in the right way is a really, really tough thing to do, and probably tough and unfair for them. So in terms of focus, there's a couple of things that we should be thinking and working with on. So one of them we touched upon before, which is to really, really work out why your clients need you right now, to work out what is that statement, what is your calls, what is the purpose of your team, what is the purpose of them in your client's life, and being able to verbalize that and go out to market with that. That will, and I've got the experience at Flume of doing this ourselves, it gives so much certainty and so much justification and confidence about suddenly what their role is. But it starts with knowing why they exist. The next bit is to co-create a 6-month vision for the team. I put 6 months, it doesn't have to be, but I want to explain a couple of words here. Number one, it's pretty obvious, but is a vision. Essentially, that is, how do we want to come out of this in 6 months? What do we want to have happened? And by doing that, you're giving just like we talked about with clients, you're giving your team the ability to get some certainty and think, where are we heading for? Because without having the end in mind, and it's something that a lot of people talk about in terms of kind of ways to be assertive, having the end in mind is very difficult for your team to work out why and how they should do anything. The other word I want to draw the attention to here, or two words, is co-create, which is so important. So there's a stat in sales, B2B sales, which says if your client is involved in co-creating the recommendation, they are 10 times more likely to buy what you've sold them. A bit of co-creation means ownership. That's why when you put an idea across to your friends or colleagues, you're so strong about trying to push it in. But if it's someone else's idea, you're not so strong and you'll kind of let it fall out. The idea here is one of the mistakes you can fall into is just telling your team what the vision is, just telling your team what they should do. Things have changed. You need a team that works together. You need partnerships and you need collaboration. And that comes from involving the team in understanding why they should work in a certain way, why they want to be where they need to be, and getting them to own it. Because without the owning, there's no belief. And they'll be sitting there thinking, well, I don't think we can do that. There needs to be full buy-in. So being brave enough as a leader to open up that decision-making a little bit to your teams is really crucial right now. And what that allows you to do by focusing on the end, the vision, it allows you, again, with co-creation, to come up with behaviors. So to come up with a contract, to come up with a charter. So what this is thinking, okay, well, if we need to be there in 6 months, whatever there is, how do we need to be behaving? A good question to ask is, if we were there in 6 months, and we walked into our office and we saw ourselves behaving and acting, what would we be doing? What would it look like? Would we be, I'm making this up, educating clients? Would we be collaborating? Would we be far more empathetic? Would we be always making a plan? I don't know what you'd come up with, but ultimately what you can do here is run a very powerful session with the team saying, where do we want to be? And brainstorm all the different ways they need to work to get there, and then theme them, agree them, and make sure that everyone buys into them. That allows you to do something very powerful, which is to celebrate the strong stuff, the stuff they're doing well, but also to stop and fix the bits where they're not demonstrating those behaviors. It also allows you to go into a conversation about communication and how you should be communicating with that sales team on a regular basis. What's too much, what's not enough, and making sure that you're working out the different platforms you can use, whether it is email, whether it is you're always open on Zoom, or whether it's using WhatsApp, and agreeing the ways of communication comes out of understanding the vision, the behaviors, and then how you'll communicate as a team. And this is crucial, because without this, it's very difficult for your team to know what to do. The next piece in terms of driving remote sales teams is around the word drive. And I talked about before a book called Drive by a chap called Dan Pink. And it's one of my favorite books around motivation. It quashes the myths around motivation and what doesn't work in terms of that carrot and stick thing that I kind of mentioned briefly earlier. But what he also talks about, which is just incredibly important right now, is this idea of intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is the idea that we want to make sure that the sales teams you're working with, and you as a sales leader as well, are coming into work, i.e. sitting on the end of the bed or going to your office, and you are wanting to work in the best way possible. You're personally driven, not just incentivized by a carrot. You're bouncing out of bed to want to work and deliver right now. And what Dan Pink talks about is that there's three core things that drive intrinsic motivation. And these have always been important, but I cannot stress enough how important they are right now. Let me take you through what they are. So number one is autonomy. We talked about micromanagement before. Now, autonomy is not the idea of just giving them the full day's reign to do whatever they want, but it is giving them some ownership, some projects to focus on, and some things that they can say, yeah, I've contributed there. So some ideas here would be to set stage goals for people throughout the week or throughout the day where they tell you what they're going to have done by certain points and they check in, as opposed to you regularly checking in. It could be that autonomy, you make them a champion of a certain area. So it might be that you give them a brief project to go, I'm making this up, but out to clients and find out what the pain points are, what sort of language they're using at the moment, what they're going through. And they then have to deliver that back to the team. It also taps into one of the later ones, which is around mastery. The other piece around autonomy is, we kind of touched on it then, but it's around effort goals as opposed to just focusing on the end goal, talking to them about the amount of effort they need to put in certain places and getting them to own that effort. So what do you want to achieve by the end of the week? What effort are you going to put in to get there, and get them to, again, co-create that and own that? But the more you can get them to buy into stuff and own it, the more they're likely to feel driven. The second angle here is around mastery. So mastery is the idea of getting better and better and better at things. And this is why, using Dan Pink's words, people climb mountains and you don't get anything out of it, but you do it every single weekend if you're that type of person. But it's tough. But the reason why is you're learning stuff. You're getting better at stuff. That's why people learn guitar or play piano, and they're not getting anything back apart from self-gratification because they're getting better and better and better at stuff. Right now, for your teams where sales aren't just flooding in, and I know it's not always like that anyway, but mastery has never been more important. Becoming a master of the art of sales and client relationships is bigger and more important than ever before, because they need to feel like they're growing. And so being able to share stories, being able to bring your groups together as teams and find out what they've learned, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what mistakes have we made, putting them on training courses, getting them to interact with our free resources we're putting out of Flume. The more you can do that, the more engaged they're going to be, because they feel like they're getting better and better. And if we're just focusing on sell, which I appreciate a lot of us aren't, but if we are, then that demotivates sometimes because they're not getting anything back and they're not getting better. And that last bit is around purpose. So autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And the idea that your team needs to know why they're doing what they're doing. We've touched upon this quite a lot, but also why are they personally doing what they're doing? An idea here is to get them to say within 6 months, what do they want to achieve? What do they want to be remembered for? What do they want to have on their CV? And create a monthly plan saying what you need to do by the end of this month and next month and next month and next month to get there. So they have a purpose that they care about. Also letting them know the difference they're making. If we acknowledge what they're going through and the effort they're putting in, it means people are going to want to do it more. If you ignore it, the research says it's as bad as shredding their work in front of their face in terms of the motivation they'll have. So we need to make sure we're letting them know the results and the impacts they're having. So to drive the team, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. To make sure that we've got the focus there, make sure we've got the vision and the behaviors and the communication. And then we'll lead on to the last bit here in terms of behaviors, which is a new one. And it's around something called client innovation. So let me just take you through how we've got to this place at Flume. When you look at the research from years ago, I say years, like 3 or 4 years ago, came from the Challenger Sale by CEB, now Gartner, and it's groundbreaking book. Towards the back of that book, there's some stuff in there around what the strongest sales leaders were doing. And one of the most important things they were doing was something called sales innovation. And sales innovation was proven to have the biggest impact on salespeople out of anything a sales leader could do. Sales innovation in a nutshell is the idea of unblocking blocked deals with clients. The other strong thing that sales leaders could do, apart from selling, was coaching. Now, what we're seeing now is because there's such a shift in what's working for salespeople, because the way that clients are operating in this crisis is very different, we've renamed this idea of client innovation. And what this is the ability of a sales leader to be vulnerable and say, you know what, I don't know the answer to this one, but we're going to collaborate together, sales team or salesperson, to work out from a client's perspective, what do they need, how do we approach this, and what's going to work. It needs a bit of planning, but it means that your sales teams are far more likely to have the right impact with their clients if they can get into the client's shoes. So the trick here really is to become experts as leaders at shifting your teams into the shoes and viewpoint of the client. Because the more you can do that, the more it fulfills the salesperson's why. I talked about earlier the sales leaders' why, being able to make it easy for sales teams to overperform. The salesperson's why is to make it easy for the client to say yes. And that means the salesperson should always be looking at stuff from the client's perspective. So more than ever right now, we need to become experts as sales leaders at shifting the perspective of our sales teams into the client's shoes, and then brainstorming how to develop client relationships and revenues, and regularly thinking about it from the client's perspective. That also works by shifting into the audience's perspective as well to work out what's going to then make the client interested. But the more we can shift perspective and put ourselves in the seat of the client and the audience, the better. And your teams have to be thinking about things from that perspective, because your client desperately needs a strong sales experience right now. We talked about last time that your client will be far more sensitive and emotionally aware to friend or foe. Your job as a sales leader is to help your teams really see that and understand that, and continuously step into those shoes of the client. So 3 core things which come out of one purpose of a sales leader, which is to make it easy for your sales teams to overperform in this crisis. Number 1, focus with vision, behaviors, and communication, a charter with your team and agreement so they know what good looks like. Number 2, don't just focus on if-then incentives. Focus on intrinsic motivation, purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And number 3, don't just expect them to be doing stuff in the right way. Shift their perspective. Get them out their shoes regularly. Put yourself in the client's shoes. Think what's going to work, and help them navigate and innovate client approaches that are going to work for the client and them, and therefore you. So we're right at the end of the majority of the webinar right now in terms of the main messages I've got to give. And in a minute, we're going to be getting some questions from the floor. I've already got 8 there, which is quite a high number. I can't promise I'll answer all of them because it depends on the depth of my knowledge and best guess. But if I can't answer them, I'll be mega open about it. Just before we go to the questions, just a quick piece. So bear with me because I've got a message come through. Okay, cool. So number 1, before we go into the questions, I want to remind you about all of these links. So if you found what we've gone through today useful, these links here, website and blogs, LinkedIn groups, YouTube, this Flume chat thing we're doing on LinkedIn as well. It's all there to try and help. We're sharing all of this stuff. So please log in as much as you can, share stuff and subscribe where possible. But I want to say a big thank you also to the AEO, PPA and MASH Media again for really pushing this stuff and supporting this approach that we're using. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over to question time, and I'm going to look at what we've got here. I'm hoping that some of these have been pushed up, so I'll do my best to answer. I'm going to caveat it once more with I've no idea what I'm about to look at because I haven't looked at it as we go through, and I will do my best. If I can't answer them, then I will not pretend that I can. Okay, so I'm going to read these out and I'm going to go through them. So 20 votes. This is a biggie. David, I don't know your surname, but hi, David. How to motivate people who are performing well but might have taken a hit on bonus due to the current situation. Wow. Okay. Um, This is tough. It's really tough because it can be a real demotivator to have money taken away from you. There's a lot of stuff to say that the thing to do with money in a perfect world is to pay enough so people don't care about money and then they're focused on their actual role. But when that has been the case and it's been taken away, that's quite tough. I think if I was in that position, and I'm not saying this is the right answer, it's my answer, but it's not necessarily the right one, is number one is being really acknowledging of their position and understanding. I think one of the most, and I've got a lot of friends who've been in this situation where they know that they deserve more money or they know that money's been taken away and their manager will pretend it's not happening and just try and blag it and say all the brilliant reasons why it's great for them still. And I just don't think at the moment that's necessarily going to work. I think acknowledging this is a tough time, acknowledging that you're doing everything as a business to help them get through this, acknowledging that as a business you're going through struggles as well, and this is why it's happening. Because I think what we often do is just tell people what is happening and it doesn't necessarily answer what they need, which is, I don't get it. That's not fair in any way. At the moment, being fair, we can be good and we can be nice, but we've got to make just decisions. And I think being open about that is really, really important. The other side of it is to tap into, and this won't always work, but tap into what motivates them outside of that. So having a conversation with your team members about themselves, when they've been most motivated, what types of things motivate them, what demotivates them outside of money. Because the interesting thing, when you look at why people are motivated, and it's a really interesting stat from Gallup, which says that the reason why people leave their job, and I know that's not necessarily the risk right now, but outside a crisis situation, the reason why they leave their job, the number one reason that's given by salespeople is because of money. Something like 72% of people say money, but actually only 8% actually leave because of money. And the biggest reason is because of their manager and the way that they're managed. It's a really interesting stat. And that's about how engaged they are, how they're motivated. So coming back to that principle of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and getting to think, how am I motivated? And letting them know you're a team. Getting them to realize this is where they want to get to and you're there to help them can have a massive impact right now because security is central for them. David, I hope this is a useful answer. Please add more if you want me to carry on. I'm going to move on to the next one. So Joe, hello, Joe. I don't know which Joe this is, but hi, Joe. This has got 13 upvotes, so very popular. Well done. How much communication is too much communication during the work from home period? Wow. I genuinely think that depends on the person, and back to that situational leadership piece. I think considering their experience and personality is really important. So how long have they been doing this and how well are they adapting to the behaviors that you've come up with is a really important piece. But I think having a conversation with them about, okay, tell me about what's going to keep you motivated through this time. Tell me about what you need from me, and coming up with that charter, that agreement, saying, if you behave like this, because you've agreed to behaviors, what do you need from me? What's the best way to communicate? You do need to have a caveat to that, which is some people are saying, I don't want you to be in contact, I work better on my own. And you need to balance that between saying, look, what I need to know that you're hitting certain benchmarks. My take is that in an ideal world, and there's no cover-all answer for this, but to be in touch 1 to 2 to 3 times a day, kind of maximum, with checking in, but getting them to, a good way of doing it is to kind of report back just what they've done and what they've achieved and how they've worked against the goals that they've set themselves, can be a really good way of doing it. So it's two-way. I know a lot of people, I was speaking to someone yesterday who is an absolute genius on running remote sales teams, and she was talking about the fact that she has a always open policy. So if someone ever has a question, she has her Zoom link continuously open. But they have regular check-ins at the start of the day, end of the day. So that's the way they do it. But I do think if you've got a relatively new person who started 3-4 months ago or 2-3 weeks ago, there might need to be more communication and contact for those types of people. Ultimately, my question is agree up front on the behaviors and communication bit and have a conversation with the individuals and take their personalities into account. Okay, so the next one from Carolyn Morgan. Hello, Carolyn. Is how do you motivate a remote salesperson who isn't performing? Okay, it's got 12 votes, so another popular one. I think it really, really depends on why they're not performing. Because a lot of this can be answered, and I don't mean to just go back to what we were saying before, but do they know their purpose? Are they not performing because they don't know why they're there? They don't know what their role is. They don't know what good looks like. And sometimes this lack of performance can come from just a lack of understanding as to what they should be doing and where they fit and how they're going to get through this. And without that clear vision or belief and behaviors agreed and an agreement of communication, it can have a dramatic impact on the performance side of things. So I think ultimately it's understanding why they're not performing and whether it's something that they can overcome. So there's an interesting piece around coaching here, because the obvious thing when we think about underperformance is to think about coaching. And one of the stats from research into the impact of coaching is most people will tend to coach the underperformance, or maybe coach a little bit the overperformance, so they can get a bit of that celebration of, oh, wow, I was included in that deal because I went out for that virtual meeting with this overperformer. But we tend to focus on the underperformers. What's interesting with the underperformers, as long as it's not just because they haven't been in the business for more than 2 weeks, it's actually because they're underperforming, we tend to spend abnormal amounts of time coaching these people, but the impact on them can be minimal because they never had the potential anyway. I'm not saying that's the case, but it is worth thinking about why they are underperforming. So the next one, so I keep on getting messages from my team on my phone, which is for the record team a little bit distracting, but I feel like I've got to look at them. So what other incentives do you recommend other than if then? Hi Daisy from White October. I would suggest that there still needs to be the if then rewards, and I would also recommend that you go through and understand what motivates people. Is it recognition? Is it achievement, etc., and have that conversation and work out ways that they want to be acknowledged and motivated. But the other way you could do this is, and there's a great example of this, there's a piece of software called Bonusly, and what Bonusly does, and I'm not don't get commission for this, by the way, so you don't have to use their system, but what Bonusly does is it allows salespeople and other roles as well, but to identify the core behaviors that are going to drive success. So how do you need to behave to achieve that goal? And what it then does is it creates peer-to-peer recognition. So you get a certain amount of points for a certain amount of money. And as a salesperson, you have to give points away to someone else you see performing like that. Now, remotely, that's more difficult, but in a weird way, what we're hearing with a lot of teams is they're in more communication than ever before. So what it means is you can start acknowledging and recognizing strong behaviors, and through small prizes, kind of you give them points and they can turn that into a small gift or whatever that might be. The point I'm making here, however you incentivize it, incentivizing behaviors creates something called a growth mindset, which is I've behaved like this, I've been celebrated, I'm going to keep on doing that. And it also shows other people have been celebrated like that, so they're going to keep on doing that. That will therefore lead to the output, which is you getting the results. But what we tend to do is just try to incentivize the output, and people are thinking, okay, but I don't know why I got there or how I get there. So incentivizing behaviors through celebration, through weekly awards, through small over the Zoom gifts or whatever it might be, could be a really useful mechanism. Is it, in a tricky market, knowing sales will be down, how do you set KPIs? I think it is incredibly difficult. And I do think it's a bit of A/B testing and acknowledging with your teams that you're working this out as well. I think they need to know that, yes, you've got strong leadership and you know kind of where you're heading and you're going to help steer the ship. But I think also acknowledging that you're working that out as well. And at Flume, what we've done is we've set KPIs, but they're KPIs around how much sharing we're doing and how many shares we're getting and how many comments we're getting and how much interaction. And that's very different from what we used to do, which is how many contracts out there, etc. But when we put those KPIs together, we very much said, well, we don't know what's possible yet. So let's review it on a weekly basis as a group and agree what's possible. So I think getting buy-in for those KPIs right now is really crucial, and being open about the fact that you are learning as well as you go through. You want to be fair, but you also want to stretch people. Okay, how do you manage a team member on your team who seems to be trying to behave like the crisis hasn't happened and is causing brand damage? I'm going to assume what's happening here, because there could be different interpretations of this, but it might be that they're going out and selling in the same way to clients like they were before. And I think you're right, it probably is going to cause some brand damage, because they're not stepping into the client's shoes and empathizing and being purposeful and being valuable. The biggest way that I've ever found over 15,000 hours of training working with salespeople, some of them very, very stubborn and not wanting to change because, hey, what we do works, why should we change it, is to shift them into the head of the client. Put them in the client's shoes, maybe even put it through the webinar we put in last week. It's still up on Crowdcast, because that talks about what the client's going through. And the most important thing right now is that salespeople understand what the client needs and what doesn't work for the clients and the big impact it's going to have. So this might sound like a bit of a simple way of doing it, but ultimately it's to get them out of their own head and thinking about what they're doing, and then getting into the client's head and thinking about why the client needs them to do things in a certain way. So shift perspective to change their behavior. Do you get them to set expectations? What is going to be achievable? I think yes, again, with a caveat, because if you just say, what can you do this week? They might not know. Giving them a way of thinking about, okay, well, what does good look like? And what behaviors do we need to be using? And what does the client need from us right now? Allows you and them to say, okay, well, let's look at your personal plan. I think bringing everyone together as a team at first to say, okay, well, what is achievable as a team this week? What do we want to be shouting about by the end of the week? And then going down individually to talk to them and say, okay, let's talk about you. Let's talk about your personality, your motivators, where you are against things, and what do you want to do? But we do need to make sure we're not giving them free rein and letting them just say anything, because depending on their personality, they might overestimate or underestimate. So being able to really get them to think about where they want to get to and how they need to be behaving, I think is a really core thing, because what that does is it's ownership. And it means at the end of the week or the end of that day where they've said, hey, these are my expectations, this is what I think I can do, it allows you to go back and say, hey, well, you said that, so what's happened? As opposed to you just saying, hit that. And most salespeople, especially in a crisis, will be thinking, well, I never thought that was achievable anyway. And they start with an excuse in mind. So we're right at the end, and we fitted that somehow into an hour. I'm very, very happy for you guys to keep feeding questions into this as we go through. So what I mean by that, if you come up with other questions, you want to put them in here after today, I think you can still do that. But also, if you want to get in contact with us at Flume through LinkedIn or through personal email, then please do to ask us any other questions. We're also working with a lot of sales leaders right now who are getting involved with us as experts. So a shout out to anyone here who knows, and maybe it's yourself, but someone who's got something to add to the community at the moment, something that can make the rest of the industry think, that's how I should be doing it. Because I genuinely believe that if we can work together in this, we can get through this. So any nominations would be really, really, really appreciated, because we're trying to get together a collection of the strongest performers out there to share best practice. The other thing to say for you guys, and this taps into the mastery bit we were talking about earlier, which is incredibly important for your teams, but also any of you guys who have furloughed workers. One of the things that they're allowed to still do is to carry on learning around the area that you guys work in. And if you think about keeping those guys motivated, in fact, we've had 2 or 3 emails just yesterday about still getting involved in this as furloughed workers. One of the things we've created is these deep dive how-to webinars, and they're based for, at the moment, salespeople. There are going to be some for sales leaders as well. We're developing those right now, but for salespeople. And there's 3 webinars that are a very, very nominal fee, so they're achievable and affordable for any individual. But they deep dive into those ideas of last time, being empathetic, being purposeful, and being valuable. They're 45-minute webinars with Q&A, and you get templates, you get how-tos, and much, much, much more detail than we went into last time to help people take that stuff away and action it. And that can be a great way to run the mastery bit. So it's worth having a look at that. We'll be talking about that on LinkedIn later, so keep an eye out for those webinars if you want to get involved in that. Again, a quick shout out to the AEO, PPA, and also MASH Media. Thank you so much for your support. Everyone who's been here today, 457 people, pretty astonishing. Thank you. And I hope these are useful. I hope you can use them. If there are people you think this is worth sharing with, please do. Even outside of media and events, it's relevant for everyone. In fact, it can be relevant for your clients. Interestingly, we've got a lot of clients, a lot of salespeople from the last session who are sharing the last How to Sell in a Crisis with their clients, because that's helping them. And one of the things we might be doing soon is how to market in a crisis as well, which will help you too. Everything we can do, we'll do. And please let us know if there's anything more you feel we can be adding. I appreciate all your time today, guys. Please stay safe and stay well. Thank you.